Hello, and welcome to another video lecture for Mr. Moser's 8th grade U.S. History class. This is another part of our Rise of Big Business Industrial Revolution Note Guide, talking about captains of industry or robber barons and looking at some business terms today. In a previous lecture, we talked a little bit about the idea of laissez-faire, where the government is hands-off. It doesn't get directly involved in the regulations of business. And during this time period in the late 1800s, known as the Gilded Age, where you have extreme wealthy Americans gaining so much wealth and power from various business practices, while at the same time you have extreme poverty in the middle and lower classes in American society. Today we're going to focus on those captains of industry, people like J.P. Morgan, the banker, Andrew Carnegie, the guy that deals with steel, John D. Rockefeller, the oil tycoon. We're going to look at some of those business practices, why they were able to gain so much power from this laissez-faire approach, and kind of see if we can maybe answer the question, well, were these just really smart businessmen, or were they robber barons? Were they somebody who were stealing the work of the poor just to enrich themselves, which was a common argument made about some of these individuals during this period of time. The lecture, textbook readings for this lecture comes to us again from Big Business, pages 619 to 622. Today we're going to talk about what is a monopoly, what is a trust, what is vertical integration and horizontal integration? Sounds scary, but it's not too tough. And then why did some refer to the wealthy business leaders at this time as robber barons? So let's talk here a little bit about some of these terms here. The rise of big business here sees what we call integration. Integration is just the combining of different industries sort of together. And there's two kinds of integrations that take place. One's called vertical, which is up and down integration, and the other one's called horizontal integration, which is side to side. Vertical integration is when businesses will control every step of the manufacturing process. From the time it comes out of the ground till it's sold to the consumer, all points in between is controlled by this particular business. We call this vertical integration. Vertical integration is more efficient because as the business, you can control all aspects of production, distribution, and then selling it to the masses. So you control every step of it. And so you can kind of make it a very efficient process, which is why business leaders of this time period liked vertical integration, especially people like Carnegie. Carnegie was able to use vertical integration by lowering the production costs. One of the reasons he was able to keep steel at such a low price was because he controlled the iron ore and coal mines that he needed to produce the steel. He controlled the railroads that shipped the iron ore and coal to the factories that he was going to make the steel. And then the steel, once it was made, to be sold and distributed out. And then, of course, he owned the steel mills as well. So every aspect of this production is controlled by Carnegie. We call this vertical integration because from the time that the iron ore and coal gets out of the ground, every step along the way of that product, Carnegie controls it. So let's look here at this idea of vertical integration. So iron ore starts in the mines. Carnegie controls that. Carnegie uses his railroads to transport this iron ore to his steel mills, which he makes the steel, and then uses his railroads to ship it out to his consumer. Every step along the way, Carnegie is in control of that production of that particular product. So vertical integration is this controlling of the product from start to finish, all the way from the raw materials needed to build it to the finished product that will be sold out to the consumers. So we call that vertical integration. The other kind of integration is called horizontal integration. Horizontal integration is when you own all the businesses in that particular field. And that's a good example of Rockefeller and his trusts, which we're going to talk about in just a second. Rockefeller controlled about 90% of all the oil refining in the United States, which means that most of the oil that was turned into usable products like gasoline or kerosene, that all came out of Rockefeller's oil refinery. So this is horizontal integration because Rockefeller controlled all the different refineries that made basically oil and turned oil into usable products. So if you think about this idea of Rockefeller, sometimes he's viewed as this leviathan, this monster, because he's so powerful, so big, because all aspects of oil is controlled by his company, by his trust. And this political cartoon, which is kind of poking fun at the Standard Oil Trust, here you have Rockefeller's company, this large octopus, that has its tentacles around the politicians and around the different branches of government, kind of in control of this oil production, which is why he was oftentimes criticized for this idea of this control of oil. Another way of looking at this horizontal integration is this concept of a monopoly. Like the board game, a monopoly is a practice in business where you try to control all production and all sales of a particular product, either by horizontal integration, where you control all the factories that make that product, or through vertical integration, where you control all aspects of production of that product from the very beginning to the very end, and when it's distributed out to the masses. Like in the board game, the goal there is to control all the squares. You want to control all aspects so that the consumer has to land on your square, has to pay you rent. In this case, if you own a monopoly of a product like steel, or in Carnegie's case, or oil, like in Rockefeller's case, you're going to make a large amount of money because you're the only game in town. You're the only person that you can buy your product from. And so monopolies grow to be very, very large and powerful entities. Now, similar to a monopoly is something called a trust. A trust is similar to a monopoly, but the difference in a trust is usually it's a group of companies and corporations that kind of work together in a united front to reduce the competition of a product and control prices in a business or in an industry. An example of a trust that's mentioned in the reading is Rockefeller's Oil Trust. So some of these companies he owned, and some of them he worked in conjunction with through these different trust agreements that he established, where he put him in control, but not necessarily direct control as the owner of that company, but he's kind of managing them through these trusts. If you think about how a trust operates, you can think of like tennis shoes. You know, there's a lot of competition, which is why monopolies and trusts are generally seen as bad things, because what keeps prices low is competition. If you got Reebok, you got Adidas, you've got Nike making different types of athletic shoes, you know, they're in competition for you, the consumer. They're going to try and keep their prices at a relatively low price so that you're going to buy from them. But if there is a shoe trust that's formed where these companies are working together, they could all, you know, kind of work together to squeeze out the competition by initially maybe lowering the prices so low that all the other companies that are not in the trust just can't compete, and they get driven out of business. And then once the competition's gone, then they can jack the prices up because you have to buy from them. And whether it's a monopoly or whether it's a trust, that's the dangers of those types of business practices, is it really limits competition. In a free market economy like the one that we have, it works best with competition. The more competition we have, the lower prices will be for the consumer, and hopefully the better the product will be for the consumer as well. So Carnegie and Rockefeller were smart businessmen. They use horizontal integration, and they also use vertical integration to streamline their businesses, streamline their industries in steel and in the oil production. But as a byproduct, they became monopolies and trusts. They basically were the only business in town for those respectful products. And so the question is, well, are they just smart businessmen, or are they somehow taking advantage of the situation to accumulate massive wealth? Here we have this political cartoon which reads, "History repeats itself. Robber barons of the Middle Ages and the robber barons of today." A baron was a lord who took the works of the peasants and exploited the peasants to gain power and strength, protected the peasants, but used their labor to basically accumulate a large amount of wealth. And you see that Middle Ages representation of the barons up here, where here are all the peasants toiling away and then have to give all their hard labor work to these lords and barons that they're living under. Here we have these factory workers and farmers and industrial workers, and the factory there in the background. All of this money they're handing over to these new barons, these new leaders and business leaders wearing sashes of trusts and banners of monopoly, where they're kind of controlling everything. And this is where the term robber baron comes from. A robber baron was the nickname given to these very wealthy businessmen because they use their power and their influence to kind of crush the competition. And they, in process, gave them more money and more power and more influence, especially in politics, because they were able to fund candidates and run candidates that were going to be very pro-business, more laissez-faire, in their approach to hands-off to government regulations. So were the leaders of business, were they just savvy businessmen or were they robber barons? Well, historians like to argue this point. You have kind of a side-by-side characteristics. Well, what is a good captain of industry? Well, Carnegie, Rockefeller, Morgan increased the availability of goods by building factories. They raised productivity. They opened up new markets. They created jobs for workers. They provided a lot of charities and national philanthropy projects to all kinds of public institutions. They organized their the factors of production and made them more efficient. But robber barons, you could argue, they drained the country of natural resources. They used their power to corrupt public officials and put laws in the books that were more favorable to their businesses that may have hurt the smaller businesses and the consumers. They drove their competitors out of business. So there was no competition for a lot of these industries. Rockefeller, Carnegie, Morgan, they were the guys. Oftentimes, they paid their workers very low wages. They forced their workers to work in some pretty dangerous and unhealthy conditions. We're going to really kind of look at some of those pieces here later on. And they kind of exploited the factors of production. So who are these guys? Are they businessmen that are just smart? Or are they kind of these evil, vile robber barons? Well, I'm a big Simpsons fan, so maybe we can kind of look at Carnegie and the villain in Simpsons, the evil businessman, Mr. Burns, and maybe kind of see, this difference. Andrew Carnegie was a savvy businessman. He started out with very little and rose to great power and wealth through his innovations. And through his innovations and wealth, accumulating all this wealth, he did found thousands of public libraries. He founded the Carnegie Institute that would fund science and technological research. So he's giving back to society. Is he a bad guy because he drove out the steel competition and paid his workers very little wages? Or is he a good guy because he gave back so much to society? Mr. Burns, the classic, villain in Simpsons, he tried to cover up the sun just to raise up energy prices so he would make more money on his nuclear power plant. He steals candy from babies, not a very nice guy. He runs a nuclear power plant that pollutes the environment. He skimps on the tartar sauce for his workers in the factory, so they have to work and eat less things they want in their factory. So it's not the best working conditions. So who here is a robber baron, and who here is a captain of industry, a smart, savvy businessman? Carnegie definitely is being portrayed in this case as a savvy captain of industry. Mr. Burns is definitely being portrayed in this case as a vile robber baron. So as we look through these different captains of industry, whether we're talking about Carnegie or Rockefeller or Morgan, they were all very smart businessmen, but at the same time they did do certain practices that definitely drove out their competition, and they didn't necessarily always treat their workers the best, but they did also give money back to charity. So you get to decide, are they robber barons or are they captains of industry? Thank you for listening, and I look forward to hearing back from you.